My name is Joy Connolly. I'm honored to serve as president of the American Council of Learned Societies, or ACLS, as we're more conventionally known. It's wonderful to see you all here. I wish we were in person, but we are able to connect online, which is good news, and we're delighted to welcome you to today's events. This is the anniversary celebration for ACLS. We were founded on September 19th, 1919, and my first year at ACLS, which I joined in 2019, marked the first time we decided to mark the occasion with, I would say, a party, but it was more than that. And this was in person before the pandemic. It was also an opportunity for us all at ACLS and many of our collaborators, the scholars with whom we work, to come together and think through some of the challenges, some of the issues of the critical history of ourselves and our organization and academia as a whole, and really seize the moment to take stock and think about our mission, and think about the state of the humanities and social sciences, and to think about the many possible futures that lie in front of us and how we can seize them and make the best of them. I want to say that when I look back at the founding documents from now 102 years ago, and even stretching back a bit further, these are documents created by mostly, not all, but mostly men who are running the learned societies that dominated the humanities and social sciences at the time in the United States. And looking at them, we see certainly, no question, traces of the privileged lives that most of them led and the privileged perspectives from which they viewed academia. But we also see, interestingly, threading through their desire to found ACLS, two goals, two insights combined, goals and insights that resonate really with almost incredible accuracy, they really echo and continue to have meaning today. And that's, first of all, the notion that American academia, higher education in particular, is a competitive and fragmented and physically fragmented, distanced landscape, and that the humanities and social sciences in particular would benefit from the flourishing of academic groups that brought together scholars across institutions, transcending the, what were even then already unequal resources available to public schools versus private ones, to large ones versus small ones. Those inequalities, as we all know, have only become more pronounced today. And so the need for these networks, these learned societies, academic professional societies, to connect scholars and institutions of all kinds, whether regional comprehensive research universities, all the categories of research universities, community colleges, liberal arts colleges. This is just the tip of the iceberg in the United States in terms of the complexity of our higher education. So the need to connect scholars across these inequalities and amplify and deepen the work that they do, that was one central goal. And the insight that this was needed, as I say, resonates today. The second one is, again, equally important for us to advocate for the humanities and social sciences, and particularly the interpretive social sciences. 102 years ago, it was clear that what we call the crisis of the humanities, has been endemic in American life since before there was an America. And going back to the 17th century, the question of what the usefulness or utility or value of higher education, has been a question that's fractured all levels of society in this country and in fact around the world. And so to not try to come up with one answer to this question, what is the value or utility of a liberal arts education or education in the humanities and social sciences, but rather to come together collectively and advocate for these fields in all their multiplicity and creativity and diversity, was another goal we see in those founding documents of the original people who came together to found ACLS. So it's in that vein, celebrating their work, casting also a critical, constructively critical eye over all that we have done and all that we are doing now and will continue to do, that we wanted to bring together for you to celebrate, mark this day, mark this week, I suppose I should say, with 4 humanists, that's what I will call them, although they may explain they have different labels for themselves, but 4 wonderful humanists who've agreed to come to the virtual stage with us today to discuss the power and the value of their humanistic educations. So let me introduce them, and then I will turn to some questions. I want to say that each speaker has charted a very different course after their studies. They've all pursued lives of service in different sectors. They've brought great value and I think it's fair to say, progress to their local communities and to the world while they've pursued their varied careers. It is really an honor, especially to welcome two people who received ACLS fellowships before they moved into roles that are not necessarily traditional ones for PhDs. So you've seen all the bios in the opening slides. I wish I could read the full, the panoply of their achievements, but I know you're eager to hear them. So let me just share brief highlights with you before I open up our conversation. Debo Adegbile is a partner in the government and regulatory litigation group of Wilmer, Pickering, Hale, and Dorr, where he serves as chair of the firm's anti-discrimination practice. He's a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, appointed by President Obama in 2016, and he serves as the board chair of his undergraduate alma mater, Connecticut College. Thank you, Debo, for joining us today. Edward Cohen, a past ACLS fellow, is an economic historian specializing in the economy and society of ancient Athens and Imperial Rome. He's the author of several articles and books on Athens. He received an award as an outstanding oil and gas executive in North America. He is a lawyer, and he holds doctorate in ancient history from Princeton, as well as a JD. He also holds, and I know is proud of, an honorary doctorate in economics from Penteos University of Athens. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
Heather McGhee is the board chair of The Color of Change. She's also an author of The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. For nearly 2 decades, Heather helped build the nonpartisan Think and Do tank, a label I love, called Demos, serving 4 years as its president. Connection there with Athens, and the Demos being the Greek word for people. She holds a BA in American Studies from Yale, a JD from UC Berkeley, and honorary degrees from Muhlenberg, Niagara, and the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. Thank you, Heather. Chikako Yamauchi, a past Mellon ACLS Public Fellow, is a strategic learning and evaluation officer at the Kresge Foundation, where she works with program and practice teams to develop and refine strategies, foster cross-team collaboration, and advance equity. Yamauchi earned her PhD at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, a master's degree in Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and a bachelor's degree at UMass Amherst. Thank you, Chikako. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to our audience. We all know how busy you are. It's the middle of the beginning of a no doubt busy month for many academics as we navigate the ongoing demands of the pandemic and continue to try to make our scholarship as good as it can possibly be, and our teaching and our classroom performance equally good. So we much appreciate the participation of everyone inside or outside academia. We're so happy to have you here to talk about our topic, the value of a humanities and interpretive social science degree, the value of humanistic knowledge, the way a college education, and in some cases, of course, you can see graduate study in humanistic fields can shape careers, shape lives, and have the ripple effect to do good in the world beyond as well. So I'm going to kick off with a few questions, and just to get some housekeeping, as they say, out of the way, I will say that we are going to have about a little over 45 minutes, I guess, of discussion among us with a bunch of questions we've talked through. We're also, though, very eager to hear from you, our audience, and we'll be taking questions. I'll remind you in about half an hour to get them up there, and we'll be I'll be moderating the questions and posing them to our panel at about 5 o'clock. And we will have a hard stop for those of you who have other appointments. We will have a hard stop at 5:30. So thank you again. Welcome. We raise a virtual toast to the founding of ACLS, and now turn to the work ahead, which I think will not feel like work given the dynamism and and brilliance of our interlocutors. And let me start with a question, and I will, I think this time kind of identify a list of people that'll go in order for you, and then we'll move to probably to more free-flowing conversation. But let me ask, starting with Debo, and then Chikako, Ed, and Heather, in that order, if you can each say a little bit about what was the principal focus of your studies in the humanities and social sciences, by way of introducing yourself to us and putting some issues on the table.
Great. Well, it's so good to be with you, Joy. Thanks for including me. As an undergraduate, my focus was on government. I majored in government at Connecticut College, and I had an African Studies minor, and I came very close to the Soc minor, but was stopped in my tracks by the statistics requirement, which I scrupulously avoided, much to my dismay. And I have not allowed my children to repeat my contemptuous ways. But I really had an opportunity to sort of study the things that called me and that I enjoyed, and that didn't necessarily speak to each other, viewed through a certain prism, but in ways that I managed, I think, to pull together both during my time as an undergraduate and on the road ahead as a professional. I have found a way to sort of stitch them together in ways that I find that those teachings, those studies remain in dialogue with each other and inform a good deal of what I do. Readings that seemed at the time not to be particularly connected to anything have been some readings that I remember and recall with a degree of regularity. And some of those books that I had so many years ago are still on my bookshelf, and are books that I consult in various contexts as I'm dealing with cases that involve our democracy, the Voting Rights Act, civil rights in America, power relationships. These are all things that coursed through the courses that I studied and with the professors at my college. And so I think that although I didn't know what it would look like when I was looking through that end of the telescope, it seems a lot more rational on the back end.
Thank you. I have a feeling we'll come back to some of the books that influenced you later on in conversation.
Joy, I know you were curious about our undergrad majors, so I'll start with my BA was in Japanese language and literature. But language is so unforgiving. If you don't use it, it leaves you. Also, as I became more fluent, I am of Japanese heritage. I'm a child of immigrants, but assimilation was much more what people did as a survival strategy in the time when my parents were raising me. So I didn't learn Japanese growing up. I did study Japanese, as I said, as in my undergrad. And I discovered that the more fluent I became, I needed to change my personality to reach like peak fluency. So that I think was a little bit of a hanging thing that doesn't connect to my master's degree is in Pacific Island Studies. And the way the Center for Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa arranged their program at the time, it looked at the legacies of colonization in the Pacific. And the places where I found hope and rebellion and resilience was in the work of the contemporary artists. And so my PhD is in art history, which looks at 5 specific artists who live and work in New Zealand who are of oceanic heritage. And it connects their voices and their stories and their acts of decolonizing the politics of representation in the Pacific. And it also looks at their creative processes. And I think that was something that stayed with me in the work that I'm doing now, thinking about how creative environments also facilitate shifts in thinking.
Ed Cohen. I was a classicist of the old-fashioned type, devoting myself to the study of Latin and Greek at the University of Pennsylvania. And then I did my PhD at Princeton, which had a wonderful humanistic doctoral program. And at the time, as an ancient historian, you won't be surprised that I go back to the 1960s. But at that time, the study of Greek and Latin was considered essential to our national defense, and national defense fellowships were given in many fields, but it included classics. I'm sure that some humanistic people were very kind to our field, almost as kind as ACLS was to me a little bit later when ACLS gave me a fellowship, which enabled me to do my dissertation. But at Princeton at the time, there was an emphasis because of the national need. We were in a struggle, a Cold War. We had to get classics doctorates done as soon as possible. I was able to do my dissertation quickly. I was fortunate enough to have it well received by the faculty, published by Princeton University Press. By chance, it was on an economic legal subject, the ancient Athenian maritime courts. And I was shocked to find that people who were expert in the field were almost entirely on faculties of law schools, not classicists. And they were very disturbed that a philologist, as they saw me, would have the temerity to express an opinion on jurisprudential science. That led me, I was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania at the time, to get a degree in law, figuring that maybe they were right, in which case I could denounce myself and be a good example as to how inappropriate it was for a humanist to be expressing an opinion on juridical science. Or maybe I would have the same ideas, in which case I could say, well, now that I'm an expert in jurisprudence, I can go forward. But the law school exposed me to possibilities of business, and by fortuitous chance, I wound up in a law firm as a resident scholar and saw what was going on and discovered that there were a class of people, entrepreneurs, who had time on their hands. I also noticed that they wasted, by my standards, that is, they didn't do any worthwhile scholarship. They wasted the time, but it would be a good idea to undertake that. So while I've continued all these decades to be associated with Penn, and I'm still an adjunct professor of classics and ancient history at the University of Pennsylvania, and to write my books, I was exposed to business. And that's been very good for me. I'm not sure how good it's been for others, but the thing that was wonderful for me was spending my time half at the University of Pennsylvania in a world purely of scholars. And although we have interactive faculties today, it will be no surprise that I spend most of my time not with the people in the business school, but with people who do the subjects that ACLS is involved with. And that was half my life. And the other half was in businesses, where I noticed that every opinion which was unanimously agreed to in academia, at least in the humanities, the opposite opinion was unanimously agreed to by people in business. I had some exposure to Oklahoma and Texas because for part of my career, I was involved in the energy business. And I've had a good opportunity to be concerned with the different values. How do you do good in the world? But I'll get to this more, I think, as we get into the actual discussion. But there's been a big shift in recent years. The business community in the main is very much supportive of sustainability, connectivity, which means making sure that people in Africa can be part of the world economy, and the support of disruptive technologies. So that now I think somebody coming from a humanistic and social scientific background coming into business really can look forward to doing some good as well as making some money.
I was an American Studies major at Yale, and I decided on that major because I read the course catalog, which at the time was a blue book. We called it the blue book. It looked like a little sort of compact phone directory, all things that we don't have anymore. And I just read it as soon as it came to my house that summer, and I had a sort of taxonomy and a little legend of, kind of want to do this, interested, but maybe requires a prerequisite. I just sort of geeked out on the course catalog. And then when I was done, I looked at the sort of dog-eared pages, and there was this big stack in the middle. And that was where American Studies was. And it was clear to me that those were the courses that were the most interesting. We had a saying at the time in the discipline, which was, to ask, why is this society telling itself this story at this time? And it was something that stuck with me. And I think that even when I applied for my first entry-level job at Demos in 2002, the thing that compelled me the most about the job description that I was applying for was that it said that the organization wanted to create a new story about poverty and economic opportunity in America. And it's that narrative work that, even as I became more and more of someone who kind of acted like an economist and was going toe-to-toe with economists and played an economist on TV, although I did not actually get my degree in economics, took a number of economics classes. It was that sort of core understanding that we use facts and figures ultimately to tell stories, to make sense of the world. And then, as I write in my book, everything we believe comes from a story that we've been told. I do think that there's a really clear through line between the discipline, the interdisciplinary discipline of American studies, cultural studies, and what I've been able to do in my career.
Those answers are a perfect platform to get into the nub of the issue that keeps me up at night, for sure. And I suspect people in our audience, at least some of them, maybe mostly, maybe nearly all, will share this. And that is that we find it increasingly the case in the academy these days at the university college level that convincing students, convincing undergraduates that our fields of study have value, are worth pursuing, not just dabbling in a course here or a course there, not that that's a bad thing, but that an immersive study in the major, in the humanities and social sciences, is going to be something that will change their life, deepen, the value of their life, open up their perspective, be good for them. It's what they should do. Fewer and fewer students are in most fields, not all, but in most fields across the humanities and social sciences, are making that choice. So having heard all of you talk about your studies and the segue, how they continue to inform your life, I want to kind of combine you might come at it, each of you, through your personal story, how the skills you acquired informed your work, and picking up on where Heather and Ed most recently started to go, or to think about the arguments academics might make, and that we might make at ACLS, and that you might make, or maybe already make in your lives, to parents, to undergraduates, maybe to teachers too. What's the story, to pick up on Heather's insight about storytelling and its power? What are the stories that we need to be telling, and that you can help us tell from your experiences about the humanities and social sciences, that make the value clear?
I think one story we can make clear is that choosing an academic education in the humanities and social sciences doesn't mean necessarily that you have to get a job in a university in the teaching field, go on the job market, and hope and pray that you're the exceptional one who will have an exceptional career. Because again and again, I've had situations on several occasions. I've even had parents call me in a threatening and or insulting fashion, suggesting that I should really consider the morality of sitting in the corporate world myself, and encouraging their children to pursue studies which will lead to their poverty. And I've told the parents when I can what I really believe, which is that over the years, business really has a position for people who can think and can communicate. And the essence of all the fields that ACLS covers really is on those skills. For years, I think there was a disconnect, however, between the purposes that business is engaged in, which for decades were strictly profit-seeking, and the self-image of people who pursue academic careers, which, as one of you said, is at least in part, to do good. And so people might have the skills that a corporation would welcome, but their attitude, which might be anti-corporate, and frankly, with good reason, wasn't welcome. Some people could choke it down and lead two lives, the business life and their real life. Others could not. Their performance might not be good, but I think in recent years, there's been a big shift in the corporate world. And I should add that the corporate world is not really a unity. There may be certain views that are common that you find throughout academia, and as I indicated, opposite views that you might find in corporations. But today, it's been forced, and I think you know this, if only from the press, that because corporations, public corporations, are owned by large agglomerations of money, funds, which themselves have been captured by decent people, there is tremendous pressure on corporate executives who don't want to do good to choke down their desire to focus only on profitability and make room for other aspects. So as I indicated in my opening remarks, the commitment to sustainability, to decarbonization, for example, to electricity and renewable assets is so overwhelming that business really has had to take that into consideration, and people who can't make that shift in the corporate side have been and are being washed away. So now I think the world that people who want to do good will find in the corporate world is probably much more receptive. So I would redouble, if in the unfortunate event that I ever get another call from an irate person, I would add that not only are we able, if we pursue the humanities and social science fields, not only are we able to segue into other areas, but we will find those other areas much more compatible than they were previously.
Thank you. It sounds as though the humanistic, well, what you're pointing to is the importance of humanistic knowledge itself, humanizing the world that hasn't always felt imbued with humanistic perspectives or values.
Well said, I think.
Joy, I think there's some additional points that Ed has helped me think about on this question of how an investment in the humanities pays its way forward as you walk through your career, and how you can think about fashioning it. So I guess there is another larger trend in certainly in our domestic economy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had ripples more broadly, which is there was a version of life after school or college for those who were fortunate enough to get there, or graduate school, where you got your degrees and then you went to work perhaps at a corporation, and then you stayed there for 30 or more years, you got a gold watch, and then you retired. That you essentially were committed to being a man or a woman at a particular corporation, and you were a lifer. And I think the economy is much more disruptive than that now, and that people live their careers almost in stanzas, as Ed's own career points out, my own, and I think perhaps some of our other colleagues as well, that you can do different things in different times. And the type of education that you get when you're a humanist and when you're studying these subjects is something that prepares you to sort of answer and apply your mental capital and your skills in a variety of contexts. And so I have worked in big law as a litigator for some substantial period of time. I worked for many years in a not-for-profit, and we didn't expressly talk about that, but not-for-profits are 6% or so of the economic revenue of the whole economy, in terms of their work and what they do. I think it's been a growing sector, and they're a very important part of opportunities on the other side of school. And there are tremendous opportunities there, and I certainly have participated in it, as has Heather. over some substantial period of time. And I've also worked in government and right now do both big law and government at the same time. And so one of the things that I think studying the liberal arts, studying humanities helps to prepare you for is the opportunity to adjust, to sharpen your skills and your mind and your approach and your readiness to take on new challenges and to bring an analytical framework and frankly, to be a synthesizer of information and experience in ways that can be applied in different contexts over time. And as a student, you might not understand as clearly how you're doing that or how it will play out, you know, the different internships you have, the in-classroom aspects, your volunteerism, your organizing, your clubs. You might not understand at the moment that doing all of this together with your humanist studies is preparing you for a life that will create a lot of doors that will be available for you to walk through, should you choose to walk through them. And I think that if we look at the reality of what it means to be an actor in our world, a job seeker, and to think about the sweep of the opportunities that are available and the interests that young people have coming out of school, that's something. And the last point I'd add to the important points that Ed made is that I have seen in my work and in my engagement that there is a hydraulic pressure that younger generations of employees are applying to corporations. When I came out and started to work in the private sector, I think that we all were figuring out how to assimilate largely and what the rules of the game were, so we could figure out how to succeed in it within the bounds of our principles and values. Now, I think that many young people that are coming out see less of a space and are willing to tolerate less of a space between their values and what they want to see in the world and the standards to which they hold their employers. And so there is an interesting new type of hydraulic pressure, which is that companies have got to practice walking the talk, not just talking the talk, because they're not only going to be held to it by external sources, they're often being held to it by their own employees. So just some additional thoughts about how the humanities help inform all of this and become sort of a lifelong tether of a perspective on the world that can be applied in different contexts.
If I can add to that, Debo's point makes me think about, even if we're only talking about large corporations and big employers, I think there's and I think this is gendered and racialized, I think there's an invisibility about the parts of a corporation that are very focused on social skills, the human resources, the management, the training, all of that core infrastructure of a functional workplace. The people who sort of are the glue of most workplaces, if we think about it, those are the kinds of skills and insights and capacities that humanities and social sciences really help develop in education, more so potentially than any specific, technical expertise for whatever widgets the company may be making. And I think we tend to see that work as less visible and less sort of essential to be trained towards, but they really can make or break the functioning of any enterprise. And so I think we need to pay attention to that as well and tell the stories of how those skills, particularly as workplaces become more diverse in terms of race, obviously, in origin, but also in terms of age, those skills of being able to understand human beings and how they tick and how to get the best out of people really do become golden.
The question seems to imply that enrollments are lower in humanities fields because the employability narrative is less linear than in other fields. Some disciplines can say, choose this major and get this kind of job, and that's seen as a strength. But the strength of the study in the humanities, as the other panelists have said, is going beyond linear thinking. To address the social issues we're facing today, we need creative and complex thinkers, critical thinkers who understand that context matters and that social systems are extremely complex. And I'm not saying there aren't creative and critical thinkers in every field or that every student in the humanities becomes a creative and critical thinker, but to the extent that pathways lead students to an outcome, the humanities pathway develops critical and creative thinking that can lead to more adaptive and transformational solutions, whereas some more technological and technical solution pathways lead to those kinds of solutions. And from the creative and critical thinkers, leaders emerge. And so if we think that in some humanities disciplines as fields that nurture leadership, it's not just a selling point for historically and still currently marginalized and otherized students, but it's an equity and justice imperative for us to stop perpetuating the status quo that continues to put the beneficiaries of privilege into decision-making positions.
Thank you. And that question, I want to talk about kind of employability too, and the kind of skills that you all look for when you look for colleagues and when you're hiring. But I'll explain why I want to ask that question in a second. But I also really want to give a huge lift to the ways in which you've all talked about the opening up of a sense of responsibility, whether it's happening in an institution, within a company, within a group of people, whether it's in one's community, but the sense of, the grasp of how, as Heather said, how people tick. Chikako, you mentioned earlier your own work on aesthetics, and the ways in which a humanistic education, whether it's aesthetics in an artwork or the way a text works, whether it's a legal text or a poem. This kind of care and attention to human communication and interaction is we just can't have any. We can't have business without it. We can't have work for social justice without it. And I'm kind of trying to pull together the different threads of what you've all said. That said, to pick up on the business thread, because we're humanists in the academy tend to be pretty good these days, in particular, especially really since the 60s, at pointing out the ways in which understanding history, language, culture, global perspectives, can animate and accelerate change for the good. We've been more hesitant for the reasons Ed pointed to and Debo too a bit, to embrace our role as preparing people for the economy and for jobs and for work in a whole variety of different contexts. So I want to zero in on this question of and try to give those members of our audience who may have students in the classroom this fall, or who are listening, keeping an eye on what their kids or nieces and nephews are thinking of doing in their college studies. You as employers, as leaders in your institutions, as supervisors, as people kind of looking out to hire good colleagues, can you tell us a story about the skills and attributes you're seeking there that try to connect the more exalted outcomes and products and great results of humanistic education with that moment of you're on the job market, you're looking for a job, you're trying to figure out what your steps are and what to play up. So what's appealing to you? Ed, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I think that desire is a very important part. If you reach the point, if a student reaches the point where he or she is thinking academics is one field that I can approach, but the general business world is another field. And I think it was pointed out by Debo that the nonprofit world represents a very important part of the total economy. So it isn't something which is off to the side. What's more, the economy is going through changes at ever increasing rapidity. This disruption is really taking place, and it's almost become the norm. I don't know of a major corporation that doesn't tremble when you think of arrogant companies. Strike that. If you think of major companies like Exxon and Chevron in the energy business that came out of the Rockefeller tradition of dominance, or BP and Shell, which came out of the British Empire, these are not humble organizations, but they've been humbled. And so it makes it much more receptive. It makes these companies much more receptive to people who are disruptors. And so I think that somebody in the humanities, if they think of business not as a last alternative or as a sellout, instead of pursuing what they really want to pursue, then they really are approaching it in the proper way, and they'll get a great reception, because businesses want people who can think, and they want people who can communicate. U.S. Grant, I once read, rose to the peak of power because he was a great writer at a time when the invention of the telegraph made it possible for orders to be disseminated in writing. And I think we're in a similar position, perhaps, in the economy, where people who can think and who can communicate are just prime for disruption, and business is being taken over by the disruptors. And so someone who herself has created a revolutionary approach to business and has been enormously successful is almost certainly going to be very receptive to somebody who comes with an unorthodox approach. The problem is to get that person to think, at least I think part of the problem is to get that person to think that there are alternatives. Because if our students really will not automatically, absolutely, in every case, pursue an academic career, then people, even as undergraduates, will recognize that you don't have to give up your interest in intellectual matters or the pursuit of intellectual matters in order to have alternatives in life, and maybe to repay, if necessary, those student loans. But there are alternatives. So I think the key thing is to open students' minds to alternative paths.
Thank you. Others of you who are hiring, seeking good colleagues, what are the attributes you seek, and how do they relate to education? Heather.
You know, Ed's comment really made me remember one of my mentors, and the person who hired me and was the president of Demos when I came on board. I remember one day going into his office after work. He sort of said, at the end of the day, come by and come see me. And I was 22, maybe 23. And he said, "You're going to go far because you can really write." Now, I had written him an email, right? And of course, that is the currency of our age, even more so now than, it was even then, nearly 20 years ago. And I think it's really, really true that, now a lot of the conversations that a generation ago would have happened by phone, a lot of the sales, a lot of the, the requests, the asks, the negotiations, they're happening. And you need to be able to write them down, and you need to be able to do it persuasively. And, from my experience in the classroom, the ways in which mobile technology has actually sort of shortened and abbreviated the form of communication casually means that there's even more sort of catch up for a lot of students to do, in the classroom, to really learn how to write persuasively and accurately. And, you get that from the classes that teach to writing, that teach the great writers. You get those skills of self-expression and persuasion. And I think there are very few careers in which that won't give you an advantage.
Yeah, I would just jump in on that point about communication today. The trick is that now sometimes you have to do it in 280 characters, as has been suggested, and so some are better at the short form than others, and not, as we all know, not all of it is high art. But the point about writing is very important, and one of the ways I think about it, and here I sort of think about it almost through the eyes of a parent, in the following way. When you're learning how to write and you have an assignment that you must write a paper of a certain length, and you're a young person, very early on, your dilemma is, how could I ever write that much? How am I going to be able to write all of those words on this topic? And when you're approaching it in that way, what you were thinking about, because you haven't had adequate experience, is that writing is a thing that's counted by the word in the way Dickens used to be paid. And you have not yet learned that writing is really a way to organize thinking and expression. And if you focus on the development of the idea, of the concepts that you're trying to articulate, and what the sequence is of how you're building the argument, the analysis, the reflection, if you focus on it in that way, it's almost never hard to however long the paper is, 5 pages, 10 pages, 20 pages. I remember as a freshman in college, when some of the seniors were walking around and had 20-page papers, I was thinking that was like was a very harsh sentence that had been visited upon them. And then by the time you get there, it all becomes easy because you think about it in a different way. And the preparatory work, the analytical work, all of the work that goes into writing is a big part of it. And so certainly in my business and in my part of my business, writing and expression are very important. But one of the things I find, we have sort of a tortuous way of hiring new talent in big law firms. We have these what we call our early interview week, and in a single day, you see 20 people in 20-minute intervals back to back, with each person knocking on the door to start the next interview when the previous one is over. And it's very hard to digest all of the resumes, to discern the differences between the person that you saw at 8:30 in the morning and the person you see at 3:30. But one of the ways that I have found that I like to do it is to focus a little bit less on what their legal experiences have been, and to focus a little bit more on what their undergraduate experiences were, what their studies were as undergraduates. And the thing I find is that folks are so practiced in running their rote speech about how to talk like a lawyer, that it's harder to access the person in a way that digs a little deeper into who they are and what their motivations were before their first year of law school, before they met with their career services people or talked to their peers about people's impressions about what law firms want to hear about what you want to do. And I find that digging into dissertations, to writings, to projects, very often in the humanities, that people have done are the things that are animating. One of my colleagues was a college professor who had an interesting path as a troubled high school student to becoming an academic. And I just was fascinated by the way his resume read, and his pathway in teaching English to high school students and then to college students. And he was my last interview of the day on one of those 20 interview days. But we just dug deeply into his study of English, into how he found an access point that made higher education and education in general relevant to him, and how he had applied it in the classroom, both how he had applied it as a student and then as a professor. And Simon continues to work with me and is very well regarded, and the partners fight to have him staffed on our matter. So I just think that it gives you a window in to who individuals are and how they think about the world in ways that certainly needs to be trained on the discipline of what we do, but it gives a point of access, a point of entry, and a point of candor about what animates the person's passions.
For me, I try to challenge myself on the ways that I privilege the power of the written word, but I am going to jump on the bandwagon here for good writing, as with my other panelists. When I'm a hiring manager, I pay attention to their cover letter. Their cover letter is really their first writing sample. It should tell me what they think the job is and what they think they're bringing to it. And what they're bringing to it is from their whole breadth of experience, not just their academic disciplines or not from their academic experience at all. And in my previous positions where I was a hiring manager, I looked for people who could lean into complexity, whose thinking was not so linear, who could write well, and who were values aligned, which Debo talked a little bit about earlier, in addition to being able to do the work.
That's this is helpful, and I have a feeling where people are taking notes here, in the audience, because these kinds of voices from outside the academy, so to speak, and I know you have a foot in both camps, but this is one of the challenges that that we at ACLS as an organization are trying to tackle. Actually, the ways in which all the talents and capacities all of you have reviewed and spoken of in slightly different ways, but your emphasis on creativity and flexibility, being able to see the big picture, being able to be nimble, disruptive, to use Ed's word, and those are not words that describe American academia or academia anywhere very well, right? Academia as a system tends to be pretty rigid, and one of the rigidities we're trying to push back on is, it's kind of metaphorically or adjacent to some of the issues you've raised in your comments, that we really need to find ways to enable students to pursue a humanistic education, but to gain sectors of knowledge, whether it be a really good course in statistics that speaks to them and where they are, or whether it be exposure to the sciences because they want to go into energy or law or some area of the economy or economic activity that makes it imperative that they learn, that develop their math skills and quantitative skills. I think we haven't been in the academy quick to respond to the need for students, not only to have agency. I mean, students have had, since the reforms of the 60s and 70s, a lot of American undergraduates have had, and in most schools, not all, I should say, but in most schools have had a lot of agency in choosing courses, but it, in a way, puts a lot on the student to figure out what Heather described, that gigantic course book, as they try to pick their way through it and find their way. So for faculty to find ways to make the academe, as students experience it, more porous and more connective, and reaching out to where students are. These are, there are many, many good people. The good news is working on these challenges, and at ACLS, we're really trying to kind of amplify their efforts and lift them up. So I do want to say, because we're getting close to 5 o'clock, we're going to pick up questions from the audience soon. There are a couple already there, but I want to encourage you all to put your questions up in the Q&A, and I'll look at them and moderate them. So, and while we're waiting for that, go ahead, Ed, sorry.
I'd like to put ACLS and you a little bit on the spot, because I think that this organization can play a major role in handling the problems that we've been discussing, because the essence, I think, of the disconnect between alternative opportunities for people who have been academically trained and their academic training is that very often, by the time you've completed or come close to completing a PhD, you know the academic world extremely well. You've spent your entire life in the academic world, but maybe you've never had exposure to anything in the commercial world. It might not be a bad idea for there to be internship programs where people are encouraged and not have it held against them as they pursue their academic career, perhaps to take a summer and work in a corporation. And I think if the program were to be under the auspices of an organization like ACLS, it would really pass the smell test. And the funding of it ought to come from corporations who are going to benefit from having a new source of talent, which otherwise might not be available to them. And it would be good for ACLS too, I think, because maybe this is one of our purposes, as shown by the fact that you convened this discussion that the panelists at least seem to be enjoying very much.
We are thinking so much along these lines, Ed, so you're not putting me on the spot at all. I will only just say one thing, that as provost of the Graduate Center at CUNY, my desire, which many of my colleagues heard repeatedly, was to have a non-academic member of every dissertation proposal committee, not the ultimate dissertation committee that passes, yay or nay on the dissertation as a finished product, because it is an academic production, but that moment of the dissertation proposal when the scholar proposes the topic, outlines the dissertation, articulates the value of the project. It has seemed to me for years that would be a golden opportunity for people like you, PhDs moving outside the academy for your work, people who never pursued a PhD but understand the enterprise and are sympathetic but constructive critics. That would be a golden opportunity to break down some of the walls that you're talking about, Ed. Speaking of breaking down walls, I actually am going to turn to a question because a really interesting one has come up. This is a question, let's start with Heather, because it starts with your book and the thesis of your, as the questioner, Karen Steinbrook, thank you for your question, rightly says, an amazing book, The Sum of Us, the best nonfiction she read this year. I think I can second that. What are the ways you see, and I'll let the other panelists, of course, think about this too, but let's start with Heather. What are the ways you see that predominantly white people in white institutions have hurt themselves by the ways in which we have approached humanities education? And what do you think we need to change to better, I would say, reach out, connect with, and serve all students who are curious about and engaged in the humanities and interpretive social sciences?
Well, that's such a good question. Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words about The Sum of Us. I have been asked in the past 9 months or so to apply the thesis to a lot of different areas of public life. This is a new one, so give me a second. The basic idea, right, that I'm trying to advance in the book is that racism has a cost for everyone. And there's so many different dimensions to it, but some of the mechanisms for that cost often include excluding, enriching perspectives, voices, relationships, etc. Right? So that exclusion that is, most often found in sort of canonical disciplines that have not been as inclusive of the work of and the representation of structurally excluded communities, is the worst for it, right? If we're trying to really understand humanity and yet we are not hearing and not really having the disciplines be informed by the full participation of the global majority of humanity, then we're not doing it, right? It's not happening, right? And so I think that core insight that diversity is a superior model for knowledge accumulation, for critical thinking, for truly understanding all kinds of endeavors, absolutely applies to the humanities and social sciences. And really, again, thank you for the question.
Thanks, and I'm happy to open it up to others. And because there's no question that the issue of especially overladen by unequal burdens of poverty, I've sometimes heard it put to me by faculty colleagues as a moral question, that if they're feeling that students of color in particular more likely to bear a disproportionate debt burden, how can they convince them to major in history or major in English? We need more than just a story, as one of our other questioners has pointed out, about the economy. We need social justice stories. We need, empowerment stories and social progress stories. But I just want to inject into the discussion that among faculty and active teachers, across the country. This is a real ethical concern.
I just think that there is a path for people to do various things with humanities degrees that don't necessarily have to be associated with paths that won't allow people to meet their basic needs, and I just think that we need to resist that narrative a bit. I've heard many people in corporations and other places, including some leading upstart disruptive corporations, where the CEOs and founders are looking for people who have studied the humanities to bring them into their company to help innovate and to think about the world and the nature of today's problems in global ways and in ways that cut across disciplines and deal with intersections of problems and people and the environment and socioeconomic issues. I would fight the premise a little bit. Part of what I think we have is a lack of adequate understanding about what the full range of opportunities are for those people who study and achieve in the humanities, and what doors will actually be open to them. Because some people who haven't been as exposed to those pathways intergenerationally haven't seen it. And so they come to school thinking about the way for me to pay my bills is a business degree. I need a business degree so I can go into business and I can make money. And many of the people that are going into business, even many of the people that are going into finance, to the extent that people are trying to choose some of the jobs that may make some of the most money out of the gate. And again, that my own path and my own commitments don't necessarily put that at the top of satisfaction in life, but to the extent that's the question and that's the proposition that we're looking at, lots of humanists are getting hired. It's a quality. It's about being compelling in the case that you can make about your studies, about the engine, about your drive, about your ability to succeed and to be an adaptive learner. And frankly, there are lots of ways now to have cross-cutting majors, dual majors, putting together a set of studies and experiences inside and outside the classroom that can help prepare people, as we have been saying, for a variety of contexts. So I don't think that we should frame it as a moral question. As somebody who studied poetry can be the president of a bank if they choose, or can argue cases in the Supreme Court or run a foundation. It's just not it's not the case that the doors are closed to you. Now, a lot there are other factors, and there's some personal qualities and drive and tutelage, and you need to have the opportunities put in front of you and think about what the path is to make yourself qualified. But I don't think that we should sit back and accept the proposition that if you're studying classics, you're only prepared to look at the old world and not think about what's happening in today's world. I would resist that premise.
Joy, a lot. I think this has gone into the attracting students question again. And I just want to point out that if we put care and support into serving the current students to nurture persistence that leads to completion, you will also attract additional students. And to the question that was written in, I think that a white middle class view does facilitate an ease in looking at students as one-dimensional. They're students, but they're multi-dimensional whole people with competing priorities. And as we think about all of the competing priorities now more than ever, we have working adults who are students, student parents, students who have dependents, and also the other intersectional lenses that you mentioned about first-gen students, students of color, students with disabilities. What are the ways that we can support and nurture persistence to completion for all students?
Great question. I'm seeing how many of the questioners, the questions we're seeing, are picking up and amplifying the concerns or issues you're putting on the table, and I think we're dealing with an audience here, and certainly everyone on this panel, that is concerned but sees great value, and part of the issue is to get the word out there. So I want to put that out there because I want to turn in a few minutes to actions university presidents and provosts and deans and faculty might take. We're going to get there in a few minutes. That's just a teaser. But before we get there, I want to take a step towards that question by looking at a question from Alice Hara. And how do you all work, she asks, for collaborative advising to open up, or could you work, I think is the question, with career centers and collaborative advising to open up ideas for sectors where students develop and further their career or grad school exploration? Have you had experience with working with universities, or how might that intersect with your world? Does that make sense as a suggestion?
So I've had the opportunity to do a lot of advising and coaching sessions for folks from my college who are current students who are thinking about pathways in the law, for example. Sometimes it's on the corporate side, sometimes it's on the civil rights side, sometimes it's something else, and folks are just interested in how you get from point A to point B. There are many formal projects that the Career Services Office has, but I do find that these short, especially now in a video age, meetups and sessions can really expand the horizon of students that don't regularly have the opportunity. Many don't regularly have the opportunity to speak to folks outside their circle or their familial network. And so being able to engage somebody that has, been around for a bit is it's just an obvious and great opportunity. And you can begin to suggest things that students can do and invest their time in while they're at school, and also provide some ideas about things they might try to do on the other side. And so I think facilitating these types of connections is important to just expand the aperture, in a sense, of what the students are thinking about. And I'm sure different colleges have different programs, but this is so easy to do in a video age. And I think all of us could be doing it more.
That's great. We have a few other questions coming in, and I want to try to cover some ground. I mean, some of them are returning to the issue of what do we say to X, to first-gen students, to students of color, to people worried about debt. How do we reach out? So I want to try to collect some of those questions and give them a slightly different end point, not what can we say to students or their parents, but maybe the issue lies, or the responsibility or the work lies at least in part elsewhere. As I hinted a minute ago, maybe it may be in the way universities are run, their reward structures, the values that presidents and provosts talk about when they talk about the value of their institutions in this incredibly competitive environment. So let me take the questions that really are about how can we reach out to students, what arguments can we make to them, whether they're immigrants, as I said, first-gen students, poor students, and ask you to think from your perspective outside academia, what could universities do differently in their own practice? What could they say? What messages could they send? Maybe thinking about your own experience as a student, what kinds of practices or habits could they change? In other words, what actions do you hope, or would you like to see college and university presidents and provosts and deans, trustees take in the coming years to preserve and revitalize these fields of study that are so dear to us?
I think one element we haven't touched on is the liberal arts college. In my opinion, universities are not disconnected entirely, and maybe not at all, from the outside economy, because they have law schools, they have business schools, they have engineering schools, they have alumni across the board. So there is some contact, but the liberal arts colleges tend really to be restricted to the social sciences, the physical sciences, the humanities generally. So there's very little opportunity. And I think a lot of students see that, and therefore the liberal arts colleges have had difficulty. Some liberal arts colleges, and I'm closely connected with Bryn Mawr, and I know Bryn Mawr has reached out to try to bring in programs such as artificial intelligence, which will be available to the students, and other other subjects that traditionally liberal arts colleges just haven't pursued. And Bryn Mawr has got the word out. And my understanding is that there's been a tremendous response in terms of increase in number of students applying, because there are schools that are known to be attractive to self-selected students. When you enhance the breadth of the college's clear interests, you enhance the number of students who may self-select. So I think there may be more room in the liberal arts college to try to find avenues of access to business and things beyond social science and liberal arts. It may be more important to do that for the liberal arts colleges than for the major universities.
You know, one thing I think is really important right now in this particular climate that we're in for school administrators to do is to protect your faculty, particularly faculty of color and faculty who are teaching race and ethnic studies, women and gender studies, the kinds of disciplines that are so essential to understanding who we are as human beings and understanding the society around us, and are under attack right now with these attacks on honest education, with these attacks on critical race theory at the K through 12 level, with the passage of executive orders and bills like the ones in Florida trying to take a sort of ideological survey of campuses, with basically the war that is being waged on education and on critical thinking. That is a very partisan strategy. And, you know, as much as we may roll our eyes at the banning of books about Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old in elementary schools, because somehow a 6-year-old can face down violent death threats, but elementary school students today are too timid and too fragile to be able to even read about it. You know, that may make us sort of roll our eyes and be disgusted, but there is a chilling effect that is happening. And there is a sense of real fear, even in, you know, the academy about intellectual freedom and about being protected from, you know, a student who may say that lesson made me feel guilt or anguish, which is literally the language in many of these laws that signals that a lesson is somehow forbidden under the new laws. And so I think one of the ways that we can make sure to advance these goals that we've been discussing is to protect the integrity of the disciplines themselves, and to protect the intellectual freedom, and particularly to protect the faculty, particularly the always underrepresented faculty of color who are doing this work against the tide.
I'd like university presidents and provosts to not leave it up to the humanities departments to talk about the value proposition of the humanities. I'd like them to come to a shared understanding of the values proposition and get clear about their messaging. And if they're not already familiar with the work the Teagle Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities are doing to revitalize the role of the humanities in general education, they might want to look at that. There's also a post-secondary value commission that put out a report that's not discipline specific, but talks about, it's called Equitable Value, Promoting Economic Mobility and Social Justice Through Post-Secondary Education. But I want presidents, provosts, deans, and trustees to understand that the messages people receive from them are not just through their statements that their communication specialists prepared for them. An institution's budget also reflects and communicates its values. And I think this is also what Heather was speaking to, of protecting their people. Their students, their faculty and staff notice how resources get distributed and draw conclusions about who and what is deemed important. And as they continue to think strategically about how to allocate the federal dollars coming to higher education from the American Rescue Plan Act, I hope they continue to think about all the dimensions of their students and the mental health and human services supports they can provide. And just before talking on this panel, I was an audience member of another panel where Darren Walker, who is the CEO of the Ford Foundation, said, everything that is right or wrong with an organization is because of the board. And he said that not to discount any hard work that's going on within the organization, but as I think about the trustees of universities, if trustees are replicating and perpetuating unjust power structures, they're working against their students.
One quick thought that borrows from some of what has been said and perhaps my last remarks. So how easy would it be for every school to have a video library of from name the town where the school is to with alums, answering 5 or 6 questions about the way in which their experience and their studies have enriched their lives personally and professionally, that would be these little like testimonial and vignettes that could have some focused questions to, that would probe and have people tell their stories that students could look at their phone on their phone. Current students, prospective students could begin to hear about the way in which the walls are broken down and the doors that get opened for you by virtue of your different study. It just seems to me to be the easiest thing in the world. And I remember I was an ABC student, a better chance as a pipeline program for minority students that helps with support to independent schools, independent high schools. And the empowerment I felt when I heard from an alum who was an alum of ABC, who had been to college and had walked a distance and had come from something that was akin to my circumstance, to what I aspired to have my future circumstance be, and could talk about how you get there from here and break it down in a way. I walked out of that session, which I remember, I don't want to talk about how many decades later, but I walked out feeling lifted in a way that opened up possibilities to me that didn't exist before I got on the subway and went to that meeting. And I just think it's so easy for educators, for leaders of schools to think about the way that we can put down the Hansel and Gretel breadcrumbs and help people see it.
Well, everyone, unfortunately, I have to run a little bit early to get on a call about the Build Back Better plan and $3.5 trillion over 10 years, going hopefully to human infrastructure in this country, which I think we can all be supportive of. So I have to jump on that right now. Thank you all so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Good evening.
Have a good evening, Heather, and thank you. When a senator calls, Heather will answer. So I hope, I know we all understand the extraordinary circumstances when we have someone involved in a panel who's also very much involved in time-sensitive politics. So we have a few more minutes.
That's a demonstration of the purpose of this panel.
Well, yes, and I want to, and this is exactly, picks up on what Debo was saying, and I think could be applied to Chikako, to what you were saying about boards. I mean, because these kinds of video resources are personalized resources that tell the story in a visibly and audibly multiple plural way. Can be used, I think, I love David, that idea of a kind of video library that would speak literally directly to students, but the same kinds of materials used, mutatis mutandis, changes as the need demands for other organizations and nonprofits could do the same. Seems like a profoundly humanistic, I work on rhetoric myself. It seems like a profoundly humanistic enterprise. Let me ask all of you before we say goodbye to our audience. Are there any final thoughts you want to leave us with before we say goodbye, just in the last 4 or 5 minutes?
I think one element that we really did not emphasize and scarcely touched on is the globalization of American business and its control to a large extent by new factors, companies and people from India, from China, and probably most importantly, the coming rise of Africa. I think people see that Africa will soon have at least a third of the people on Earth. It's the one continent which really hasn't yet been tied in, connected, as they say, to the international economy, but it's definitely coming. And if we could communicate that to students of color, especially students who might have an interest in Africa, there's another area, internationalization, where ACLS could really be an intermediary between the people coming out of universities, going into universities, and the outside world of business. It's not all domestic American.
Thanks, Ed. I'm glad you said that. And I want to call out a questioner who asked about the immigrant experience specifically. And I think behind that question was a lot of what a whole area in which academia in the US has yet to confront. Thank you.
I want to lift up, Debo was talking about one-on-one connections and coaching with folks. And, you know, he said it's not that hard in this day of video, but also back in the day of just telephone, it wasn't that hard to have an informational chat with someone. And those were really valuable. And for me, I've been away from the academy. I haven't interacted with academia at all for several years. And so I reached out to people, and I just want to bring their names into this space. If anything I said seemed misguided or offensive, that's 100% me. But if anything I said made sense and it was something that you resonated with, it was probably with the help from Saul Valdez, Rebecca Chamberlain Krayenga, Erica Brown, Shamar Bibbins, Sam Kiyomi Turner, Ashley Johnson, Paul Hunt, Sammy Berger, and Yagna Chowdhury. I just want to bring their names into the space to give them credit for their knowledge and their expertise.
I just want to pick up on something else that Chikako said. She talked about persistence. And I think that those of us who care about the humanities have got to take the lessons of persistence ourselves and really think about ways that we add a new level of creativity to the knowledge we have about the role and place and import of these fields of study on human endeavor. It's, you know, it's really that simple. And I know that there are waves, there are ebbs and flows, there is excitement about tech and STEM, and those things are really, really important. But I'm here to tell you from my experience that the humanists have a place at the table, and that where things are done, as some of our colleagues have said, without adequate input and consideration of a more rounded perspective, you very often wind up down a path, whether it's AI or something else, that needs to be unwound by people that are experienced in understanding a broader conception of human interaction. And so I would not be cowed. I would lean into this with great verve, as you might get, and vigor. And if we can help, I'm sure there are many others out there where we will be pleased to carry this conversation forward.
That's great to hear. That ACLS, and I'm very grateful to Ed for saying what he did in such an exhortatory and inspiring way a few minutes ago. I mean, ACLS is one of a group of organizations. You know, we're not alone, of course, and one of our kind of happiest duties and responsibilities is, just as Chikako did, I mean, is lifting up the names of organizations and partners, funders, other nonprofits, academic adjacent organizations, and people within the academy too. A whole range of people who are working to keep humanistic knowledge vital, alive, responsive to students, standing up for itself. And one of the questioners said, do we have to connect arguments for the humanities and social sciences, and especially maybe the humanities and arts, to instrumentals? Can't they just stand on their own? I mean, I see this as very much a plural landscape where, and like Hannah Arendt, I believe the fundamental human condition is plurality. We've got to have a lot of different arguments and cases out there, because not just one will not do the job. And so you've helped us articulate this. I'll leave you with one final thought about what ACLS is trying to do in the area of making universities more responsive, and that is we're working with, again, a bunch of partners, 6 teams in 6 different schools, along with about 15 individual participants in an effort called the Design Workshop for a New Academy. It's funded by the Luce Foundation very generously. And many of those groups are tackling the question of how the university, how the college rewards its faculty, how they get promoted, how they get raises, how they get hired in the first place. Let's look at those categories and expand them and recognize the multiplicity, again, the plurality of work that faculty do. So that's one way in which we are trying concretely to shift some of the very old and still valuable, but sometimes too rigid structures of expectation and reward in the academy. It's exciting work. We hope to report on that in a year, maybe at the next celebration. Let me thank sincerely all the panelists for your contributions today. It's not easy to talk in terms that are not kind of just vague and Pollyanna-ish about the value of the humanities and social sciences, but you did far more than that, and for that we really appreciate your contribution and your time in your busy lives. So thank you. I want to thank our audiences. I also audience members everywhere, all over the world, as I can see from the participant list. Guessing from the names there that we're seeing people from around the planet, which is exciting. And I want to also thank heartily a group of people at ACLS who make this event and other events possible. Riska Putri, Mary Richter, Hyun Kim, Robert Keogh, Nicole Glotzer, Sandra Bradley. I hope I haven't missed anyone. I looked at my list, but thank you all for working to make this event smooth and accessible to everyone. Again, thank you to the panelists for joining us. We will continue to work and advocate to strengthen our, just the incredible, extraordinary achievements that our scholars and thinkers and students inside and outside the academy are engaged in every day. That's our job. Thank you again. Have a good evening.